The elegant ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco glittered with anticipation. Society's elite had gathered for what promised to be the event of the season, the introduction of Rashid Al-Farouq's American bride. The wealthy Dubai entrepreneur had been the subject of endless speculation since news of his engagement broke 3 months prior. Who was this mysterious woman who had captured the heart of one of the Middle East's most eligible bachelors? Reporters positioned themselves strategically, society columnists sharpened their observations, and the curious wealthy mingled with champagne flutes, all waiting for the grand reveal. But as the evening's carefully orchestrated introductions began, Margaret Chen, a 63-year-old hotel housekeeper finishing her shift, accidentally stumbled into a private hallway. What she witnessed there would shatter the fairy tale everyone believed, expose a web of deception that spanned 2 continents, and ultimately lead to the most unexpected love story of all. Sometimes the truth arrives not through grand revelations, but through the quiet observations of those we never notice, those who clean our rooms, serve our meals, and see what we think remains hidden. This is the story of how everything everyone thought they knew about love, marriage, and truth turned out to be beautifully, devastatingly wrong. Margaret's knees ached as she pushed her housekeeping cart down the service corridor of the Fairmont's 14th floor. 37 years she'd worked in this hotel, watching countless celebrations, weddings, and society events from the invisible margins where staff existed. Her graying hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, her uniform pressed despite the long shift, her movements efficient from decades of practice. She'd learned long ago that wealthy people rarely noticed the help. They looked through you as if you were merely another piece of furniture. It was both a blessing and a curse, this invisibility. A blessing because it meant she could work in peace, supporting her retired sister in their small Oakland apartment. A curse because sometimes she wondered if anyone truly saw her anymore, the real Margaret beneath the uniform. Tonight was different, though. The entire hotel buzzed with unusual energy. Extra security filled the corridors, event staff rushed past with frantic urgency, and the ballroom downstairs had been transformed into something from an Arabian Nights fantasy. She'd glimpsed it earlier, the golden draping, the elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than her annual salary, the crystal chandeliers throwing rainbow light across polished marble floors, all for Rashid Al-Farouq's engagement celebration. Margaret had seen him once, 3 days ago, striding through the lobby with the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively step aside. Tall, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of complicated histories. Handsome in that distinguished way that improved with age, and wealthy beyond anything Margaret could imagine. His family's shipping empire and technology investments had made headlines, even in publications she occasionally browsed during lunch breaks. She'd just finished restocking the linen closet on 14 when she heard raised voices echoing from around the corner. Margaret froze. The service hallway connected to a private wing reserved for VIP guests, normally deserted during events. She should turn back, return downstairs, mind her own business. But something in the tone of those voices stopped her. Not anger exactly, but desperation, fear. Against her better judgment, Margaret wheeled her cart quietly forward, staying close to the wall. What she saw around that corner would haunt her, confuse her, and ultimately change everything. A young woman, perhaps 30 at most, stood pressed against the wall while an older woman in an expensive designer suit spoke urgently, adjusting the younger woman's jewelry, fixing her hair with rough, impatient movements. "You remember everything I told you," the older woman hissed. His mother's name, his sister's children, the compound in Dubai, all of it? Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The young woman being primped and prepared was stunning. Model, beautiful, with golden hair, styled in elaborate waves. Her gown, a confection of silk and crystals that probably cost more than Margaret's car. But her face held none of the joy you'd expect from a bride-to-be. Instead, her expression was frozen, almost numb, as she nodded mechanically at the older woman's instructions. "I remember," she said quietly, her voice carrying a faint accent, Eastern European, maybe Russian or Ukrainian. "I say I meet Rashid at charity gala in New York 6 months ago. We fall in love over shared interest in education and children's causes. I am school teacher from Kansas who want to make difference in world." The words came out rehearsed, lifeless, like lines from a play she'd memorized without understanding. The older woman, clearly American, perhaps 60, with the hard edges of someone who'd fought her way to wealth and position, gripped the young woman's shoulders. "Not I am, Natasha. I'm. You need to sound natural, like you grew up here, and smile more. You're supposed to be madly in love, remember? This is your fairy tale." She stepped back, examining Natasha like a sculptor assessing a statue. "Everything's riding on tonight. If Rashid's business partners or family members suspect anything, if anyone questions the story, the whole arrangement falls apart. You understand what that means?" Natasha's eyes flickered with something, fear, resignation, perhaps a hint of rebellion, but she nodded again. "I understand, Mrs. Pemberton. I do my part. I get what you promised. Green card, money, new life." Margaret pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she feared they'd hear it. This wasn't right. This wasn't a real engagement, a real love story. This was some kind of arrangement, some kind of deception. But why? What could possibly motivate such an elaborate fraud? Before she could process what she was witnessing, Mrs. Pemberton glanced at her diamond-studded watch and cursed softly. "We're late. Remember? Besotted, grateful, a little shy but deeply in love. You've found your Prince Charming and you can't believe your luck. Can you do that?" Natasha drew a deep breath, and Margaret watched in amazement as the young woman's entire demeanor shifted. Her shoulders straightened, her face softened into an expression of dreamy contentment, and when she smiled, it looked almost genuine, almost. "I'm ready," she said, her accent suddenly less pronounced, her voice warmer, more confident. "Let's go meet." "Everyone!" Margaret remained frozen in the hallway long after the two women disappeared toward the elevators. Her mind raced through what she'd witnessed, trying to make sense of it. Should she report this to hotel security, but report what exactly? That she'd overheard what might be a conversation between a nervous bride and her wedding planner? That she had a feeling something was wrong? She had no proof, no real evidence, just instinct honed over 63 years of observing. People of learning to read the subtle tells that revealed truth from performance. And something about that scene had been fundamentally wrong. The young woman's fear, the older woman's calculating coldness, the rehearsed story and the promise of payment. This wasn't love. This was a transaction. She thought about Rashid Al-Farouq, that distinguished man she'd glimpsed in the lobby. Did he know? Was he part of this arrangement, or was he being deceived as thoroughly as the public? Margaret had read enough tabloids during her breaks to know that wealthy men sometimes entered into marriages of convenience, green card arrangements, business mergers disguised as romance, trophy wives purchased like expensive cars. But something about Rashid's demeanor had suggested depth, intelligence, perhaps even loneliness. The way he'd paused at the lobby window, staring out at the city with an expression of such profound solitude that even Margaret, invisible as always, had felt a pang of recognition. She knew that loneliness, had lived with it since her husband Daniel died 8 years ago, leaving her with memories and an empty apartment that echoed with absence. Margaret made a decision then that surprised even herself. She would attend the party. Not officially, of course. Housekeeping staff weren't invited to society celebrations, but she knew this hotel's layout better than anyone. She knew the service entrances, the observation alcoves, the places where staff could watch events without being seen. She needed to understand what was happening, needed to know if this Arab billionaire was a villain or a victim, if this beautiful young woman was a predator or a pawn. 37 years of invisibility had taught her how to observe without being observed. Tonight, that skill might actually matter. Tonight, she might actually be able to do something that mattered, even if she didn't yet know what that something was. She straightened her uniform, checked that her employee badge was properly displayed, and headed toward the service stairs that would take her to the ballroom's upper gallery. Whatever was about to unfold, Margaret Chen would witness it, and somehow she sensed she would be called upon to act. The ballroom from the gallery was even more spectacular than Margaret had imagined. The upper observation level, normally closed during events, provided a perfect vantage point. She could see everything while remaining hidden in shadows behind the decorative screen that separated the gallery from the main floor. Below, 500 guests mingled among tables draped in cream and gold, centerpieces of white roses and orchids rising like small gardens from each surface. A string quartet played something classical and elegant, though Margaret couldn't name the composer. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation, everyone waiting for the promised introduction, the moment when Rashid Al-Farouq would present his American bride to San Francisco society. Margaret spotted Rashid near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of impeccably dressed men and women who seemed to hang on his every word. Even from this distance, she could see the grace with which he moved, the courtesy he extended to each person who approached him. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his bearing suggesting someone comfortable with wealth and power, but not corrupted by either. When he smiled at something one of the older women said, the expression reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. Margaret found herself thinking that Daniel had smiled like that. Genuine warmth that couldn't be faked. She shook her head slightly. Dangerous thinking. This man was a stranger, likely complicit in whatever fraud was about to unfold. A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd as Mrs. Pemberton entered from the main doors, Natasha on her arm, like a prize being displayed. The young woman had transformed completely. Where minutes ago she'd seemed frightened and uncertain, now she glowed with apparent joy. Her smile was radiant, her movements fluid and confident. She waved to the crowd with just the right mixture of shyness and delight, as if overwhelmed by the attention but trying to be gracious. Margaret watched as Rashid's expression changed upon seeing her, but it wasn't the look of a man greeting his beloved. Instead, his face showed polite interest, perhaps approval, but nothing deeper. No light in his eyes, no unconscious movement toward her. He waited for her to approach him, formal and courteous, but not eager, not in love. And when Natasha reached him, when she stood on tiptoes to kiss his cheek with performative affection, Margaret saw Rashid's slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible stiffening of his shoulders. This was a man going through motions, fulfilling some obligation. Whatever this arrangement was, Margaret realized with sudden clarity, Rashid Al-Farouq was as much a prisoner of it as young Natasha. The microphone feedback squealed slightly as Mrs. Pemberton tapped it, drawing everyone's attention to the small stage area. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying that particular authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "I'm Catherine Pemberton, and I have the extraordinary pleasure of introducing you all to a love story that proves fairy tales still happen." Margaret watched the crowd lean forward, hungry for the romance they'd been promised. 6 months ago, my dear friend Rashid attended a charity gala in New York. The same gala where this beautiful young woman, Natasha Ivanova, was volunteering. Natasha teaches elementary school in a small Kansas town, but she's always believed in giving back, in making the world better for children who need advocates. Catherine gestured to Natasha, who smiled with perfect timing, modest and warm. Rashid and Natasha discovered they shared that passion for education, for children's causes, for using wealth and privilege to lift others. What began as a conversation about building schools became coffee dates, then long phone calls, then stolen weekends when Rashid could escape his business obligations and Natasha could take time from her teaching. The story rolled out smoothly, each detail designed to appeal to the romantic sensibilities of their audience. Young schoolteacher meets wealthy philanthropist. Shared values bridge the gap between their worlds. Love conquers all differences of culture, wealth, and background. It was perfect. too perfect. Margaret noticed how Rashid stood slightly apart from Natasha as Catherine spoke, his hand not seeking hers, his body language formal rather than intimate. "And now," Catherine continued, building to her crescendo, "Rashid and Natasha have decided to make their commitment official. This celebration tonight marks not just their engagement, but the joining of two worlds, two cultures, two hearts that found each other against all odds." The crowd applauded enthusiastically, champagne glasses raised in toasts. Someone called out for a kiss, and others took up the chant. Natasha turned to Rashid with an expression of such longing that Margaret almost believed it. Almost. But she'd seen that same expression minutes ago being practiced in the hallway, being coached by Catherine with cold precision. Rashid leaned down and kissed Natasha's cheek chastely, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, the kiss of a distant cousin, not a lover. Several people in the crowd seemed to notice the lack of passion, whispering to their companions, but most were too caught up in the fairy tale to question the reality beneath the performance. Margaret remained in the gallery for the next hour, watching the celebration unfold below like a theatre production. Natasha played her role flawlessly, laughing at appropriate moments, touching Rashid's arm with affection that seemed genuine, answering questions about their relationship with practiced ease. She told stories about their first meeting, their shared dreams of building schools in underprivileged communities, her shock and joy when he proposed during a private dinner overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. Every detail had been carefully constructed to appeal to the audience's desire for romance. Meanwhile, Catherine Pemberton circulated through the crowd like a general surveying troops, ensuring everyone accepted the narrative, guiding conversations away from potentially difficult questions, always watching Natasha with the intensity of a director monitoring her star performer. But it was Rashid who fascinated Margaret most. Throughout the evening, she watched him fulfill his obligations with impeccable courtesy, thanking guests for attending, discussing business ventures with associates, accepting congratulations with gracious humility. Yet underneath that polished exterior, Margaret detected something else: loneliness, resignation, the look of a man trapped in circumstances he couldn't escape or didn't know how to change. When he thought no one was watching, his smile faded, his shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and his gaze would drift toward the windows overlooking the city lights. Margaret recognized that look because she'd worn it herself countless times, the expression of someone going through life's motions while feeling profoundly alone. She was so focused on Rashid that she almost missed the moment that would change everything. A woman in her 40s, elegant in a deep blue gown, approached Natasha during a lull in the festivities. Margaret couldn't hear their conversation from the gallery, but she could read body language. The woman spoke animatedly, gesturing as she shared what appeared to be a story. Natasha nodded and smiled, responding with apparent interest. But then the woman asked a direct question, leaning closer with genuine curiosity. Margaret watched Natasha's smile freeze slightly, saw her eyes dart toward Catherine across the room. Whatever question had been asked, Natasha didn't know the answer. She improvised something, laughing and touching the woman's arm, but the moment of hesitation had been noticeable. The woman's expression shifted, not to suspicion exactly, but to confusion. Something wasn't quite right. Margaret decided it was time to risk a closer observation. She knew the ballroom's layout intimately. There was a service alcove near the stage where staff could monitor supplies and coordinate with catering without being obvious. If she timed it right, she could slip down there during the next speech, position herself where she might actually hear conversations. It was dangerous. If anyone questioned why housekeeping staff was lingering at a private party, she could lose her job. But Margaret found that after 37 years of playing it safe, of staying invisible and unnoticed, she suddenly cared more about truth than security. Something about this situation demanded intervention, even if she didn't yet know what form that intervention should take. She made her way down the service stairs and through the narrow corridor that led to the alcove. From this position, partially hidden by an elaborate flower arrangement, she was close enough to hear actual conversations. The woman in blue who'd questioned Natasha was now speaking with a distinguished couple in their 60s. "I don't know," she was saying, her voice troubled. "I taught in Kansas Kansas for 15 years before moving to California. I asked Natasha which district she worked for, and she said Topeka Elementary. But there is no Topeka Elementary. The schools in Topeka are named after presidents and historical figures. When I mentioned that, she laughed it off and said she'd gotten confused, that she meant Eisenhower Elementary. But that didn't feel right either. Her whole demeanor changed, like she'd been caught in something. The older man frowned. Perhaps she was just nervous. This must be overwhelming for her, meeting all these people. But his wife looked thoughtful. Or perhaps Catherine's fairy tale isn't quite what it seems. I've known Catherine Pemberton for 20 years, and that woman doesn't do anything without calculating the angles. She's been trying to break into Rashid's business circles for months, ever since his company started investing in Bay Area technology ventures. I wonder if this whole romance is actually a business arrangement of some kind. The conversation made Margaret's instincts sharpen. She wasn't the only one sensing something off about tonight's celebration. If others started questioning the narrative, the careful house of cards Catherine had constructed might begin to collapse. She was so focused on that conversation that she didn't notice Rashid approaching from the opposite direction until he was nearly beside her alcove. He'd stepped away from the crowd, seeking a moment of privacy, his phone in his hand. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the shadows as he made a call, speaking in what she assumed was Arabic, the language flowing with an elegance that needed no translation. His tone was weary, frustrated, perhaps even angry. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but when he ended the call, he stood there staring at his phone with an expression of such profound sadness that Margaret felt her heart clench. Whatever burden this man carried, it was breaking him. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Margaret stepped forward from the alcove. "Excuse me, Mr. Al-Farouq?" Her voice was quiet but clear. Rashid turned, startled, his guard immediately rising. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Margaret continued, her heart hammering, "but I think there's something you need to know." Rashid's expression shifted from surprise to guarded curiosity as he studied Margaret in her housekeeping uniform. "Your hotel staff?" he asked, his English carrying only the slightest accent, his tone more puzzled than annoyed. "Yes, sir. I'm Margaret Chen. I've worked here for 37 years. She took a breath, knowing she was about to cross a line she couldn't uncross. "I wasn't spying deliberately, but about an hour before your party began, I saw something in the service hallway. I heard something about your fiancé." She watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. Would he be angry, defensive, complicit? Instead, she saw only a kind of resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this shoe to drop. Rashid glanced toward the ballroom, where the party continued without him, then back to Margaret. "Tell me," he said simply. So Margaret told him. She described the scene she'd witnessed, Natasha being coached by Catherine, the rehearsed story about their meeting, the promise of a green card and money, the young woman's fear, and Catherine's calculating coldness. She spoke quickly, but clearly, leaving nothing out, watching Rashid's expression grow darker with each revelation. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with what might have been anger or shame, or some mixture of both. "You're certain of what you heard?" he finally asked. "Completely certain, Mr. Al-Farouq." He let out a long breath and rubbed his face with one hand. "Please call me Rashid. And thank you, Margaret. You've confirmed what I've suspected for weeks, but couldn't prove." He looked at her directly then, and Margaret was struck by the intelligence and pain in those dark eyes. "I suppose you're wondering how a supposedly intelligent businessman ends up in such a ridiculous situation." Margaret shook her head. "It's not my place to wonder, sir. Rashid, I just thought you should know the truth before things went any further." He smiled at that, a sad, rueful expression. "You're kind to give me the benefit of the doubt. The truth is both simpler and more complicated than you probably imagine. Shall I tell you how I ended up engaged to a woman I barely know, celebrating a love that doesn't exist?" Rashid leaned against the wall, his formal posture relaxing slightly, as if the act of being honest allowed him to shed some protective layer. 6 months ago, my mother became seriously ill. Cancer. She underwent aggressive treatment in Dubai, and for a while, we thought we might lose her. His voice carried the weight of that fear, the memory of helpless watching. During her recovery, she became obsessed with one thing: seeing me settled, married, happy before she died. She's 68, traditional, and she believes a man my age, 57, should have a wife and family. She doesn't understand or accept that sometimes life doesn't follow those prescribed paths. Margaret felt an unexpected wave of sympathy. She understood family pressure, the weight of others' expectations. You couldn't just tell her you'd find someone when you were ready. Rashid's laugh was bitter. You don't know my mother. She's loving but relentless. She began arranging meetings with suitable women in Dubai, in London, in New York. Every phone call became about my marital status, every visit dominated by her matchmaking, and her health wasn't improving as hoped. The cancer was more aggressive than we'd initially believed. I watched her fade, watched her worry consume her, and I felt helpless. So when Catherine Pemberton approached me at a business conference 3 months ago with a proposition, I was vulnerable enough to listen. What kind of proposition? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. A business arrangement disguised as romance. Catherine had connections I needed for a major technology investment in Silicon Valley. She also had a young woman, Natasha, who needed immigration papers and was willing to play the role of devoted fiancée. The plan was simple. We'd pretend to be engaged for 6 months, long enough to satisfy my mother and finalize my business deals. Then we'd quietly separate, citing irreconcilable differences or whatever story worked. Best, Natasha would get her green card, Catherine would get her business connections and a substantial finder's fee, and I would get my mother's peace of mind and my business opportunities. Everyone wins. His tone suggested he no longer believed that. But it's not working, Margaret said softly, a statement rather than a question. Rashid shook his head. I underestimated how complicated deception becomes once you start living it. Every lie requires 10 more lies to support it. Every public appearance means more performance, more people drawn into the fiction. My business partners in Dubai started asking questions. Why hadn't they met this woman? Why was the relationship moving so quickly? What did I really know about her background? My sister flew in from London last week and spent one dinner with Natasha before pulling me aside to ask if I was being blackmailed. He smiled sadly. Apparently, I'm not as good an actor as I thought. She could tell something was fundamentally wrong. Margaret thought about what she'd witnessed upstairs, the careful choreography, the practiced responses, the lack of genuine connection between Rashid and Natasha. And your mother? Does she believe it? Rashid's expression grew even more pained. That's the worst part. She does, completely. She's overjoyed. She thinks I've finally found happiness, that she can die in peace, knowing I won't be alone. She's planning to fly here next month for the wedding. She wants to be well enough to attend, so she's pushing through treatments that are making her terribly ill, all for a wedding that isn't real, to celebrate a love that doesn't exist. The guilt in his voice was palpable. I tried to tell myself it was a kindness, giving her this happiness in her final months. But now I realize it's just another form of cruelty. When the truth comes out, and it will come out, the disappointment will probably be worse than if I'd been honest from the start. Margaret, I felt an unexpected urge to comfort this man, this stranger who was revealing his failures with such painful honesty. Why are you telling me all this? I'm just housekeeping staff. You don't owe me explanations. Rashid looked at her directly, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression, a kind of relief, perhaps even hope. Because in 30 seconds, you've shown me more honest concern than I've encountered in months of business negotiations and social performances. Because you took a risk to tell me the truth when you could have just minded your own business and kept your job secure. And because I think I need help from someone who has no agenda, no investment in this charade, someone who might actually care about what's right, rather than what's profitable. He paused. I know it's an enormous presumption, and I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm asking anyway. Will you help me figure out how to untangle this mess I've created? Margaret should have said no, should have backed away from this complicated situation, returned to her predictable life of clean sheets and tidy rooms and comfortable invisibility. But something in Rashid's honest desperation, in his willingness to admit mistakes and seek help, touched a part of her that had been dormant for years. Since Daniel's death, she'd been existing rather than living, going through motions rather than making choices. Maybe this was an opportunity to matter again, to use her lifetime of observation and instinct for something beyond making beds and scrubbing bathrooms. I'll help, she heard herself say, though I'm not sure what a 63-year-old housekeeper can do about such a complicated situation. Rashid's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes. You'd be surprised what wisdom and experience can accomplish that wealth and connections cannot. They made a plan quickly, knowing Rashid would be missed at his own party. Margaret would continue, observing, gathering information about Catherine's true intentions and Natasha's actual situation. Rashid would start documenting the arrangement, protecting himself legally while figuring out how to extricate himself without destroying his business deals or crushing his mother's hopes. They exchanged phone numbers, Margaret giving hers with the surreal awareness that an Arab billionaire now had her contact information, and agreed to meet the following day at a quiet cafe where they could talk without being overheard or observed. One more thing, Rashid said as Margaret prepared to slip back through the service corridor. Why did you come forward? You could have just ignored what you saw. Margaret thought about that question, about the real answer beneath the obvious one. I've spent most of my life invisible, she said finally. People look through me, around me, never at me. You see, but you're not seen, and maybe I'm tired of that, or maybe I just recognized something in you, that loneliness, that feeling of going through the motions of a life that doesn't quite fit. I don't know, but I saw something wrong, and I decided for once to speak up. Consequences be damned. Rashid studied her with an intensity that made Margaret uncomfortable and oddly gratified simultaneously. I think you've been seen all along, Margaret. People just weren't wise enough to look. And with that, he returned to his party, his performance, his beautiful fiction, while Margaret slipped back into her comfortable shadows. But something had shifted. The invisible woman had been seen, and the lonely billionaire had found an unlikely ally. Tomorrow, the real work of unraveling deception would begin. The following afternoon, Margaret sat in a corner booth at Cafe Greco, a small Italian cafe in North Beach, nursing an espresso and wondering if Rashid would actually show up. Perhaps in the clear light of day, he'd reconsider confiding in his housekeeper, decide to handle things through lawyers and business associates like a sensible, wealthy person would. But at precisely 2 o'clock, he appeared, dressed casually in dark slacks and a simple button-down shirt, looking somehow more real than he had in his formal suit. He slid into the booth across from her, ordered a coffee, and pulled out a leather portfolio. I've been thinking all night about how to approach this, he began without preamble. The immediate problem is Catherine. She has leverage, contracts related to my technology investments that she can complicate if I don't fulfill our arrangement. But more concerning is what she might do to Natasha. Margaret leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? Rashid opened the portfolio, revealing documents and photographs. I did some research last night. Natasha Ivanova isn't just some opportunistic immigrant looking for a green card. She's trapped. Catherine brought her to the States 2 years ago on a work visa, supposedly to be a nanny for Catherine's grandchildren. But once Natasha arrived, Catherine took her passport, controlled all her documents, and essentially held her hostage. She works as domestic help in Catherine's home, unpaid except for room and board. When Catherine came to me with this arrangement, part of the deal was that Natasha would be freed afterward, given her papers, given money to start a real life. Catherine sold it as a humanitarian gesture, helping a young woman escape poverty. But now I understand it's just exploitation with better marketing. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. She'd seen this before, wealthy people using vulnerable immigrants as disposable labor, controlling them through fear and legal manipulation. So Natasha is as much a victim as you are, maybe more. Rashid nodded. Which means, when I extricate myself from this mess, I need to make sure Natasha isn't punished for it. If Catherine feels crossed, she'll likely deport Natasha or worse. The woman has connections in immigration enforcement. She's bragged about it at social gatherings. She sees immigrants as commodities to be exploited or disposed of as convenient. He looked at Margaret seriously. Any solution we devise needs to protect Natasha. She doesn't deserve to pay the price for my weakness and Catherine's manipulation. Over the next hour, they strategized like unlikely co-conspirators. Margaret shared her observations from the party, the questions being raised by guests, the cracks already appearing in Catherine's carefully constructed narrative. Rashid explained his business situation in detail, the technology investments that would transform his company but required Catherine's connections to Silicon Valley venture capitalists, the contracts binding him to various agreements, the timeline that had seemed manageable when he was desperate but now felt like a noose tightening. What if we expose Catherine's exploitation of Natasha? Margaret suggested. If there's evidence of labor trafficking, immigration officials might intervene on Natasha's behalf rather than deporting her. Rashid considered this. It could work, but we'd need solid documentation. Catherine's too smart to leave obvious evidence lying around. We'd need someone on the inside, someone who could access her home, her files, her communications. They both fell silent, understanding the implication. Margaret would need to get close to Catherine, somehow gain access to her private spaces. It seemed impossible. A hotel housekeeper had no logical reason to be in Catherine Pemberton's orbit, unless... The wedding, Margaret said suddenly. Catherine will need staff for wedding preparations, extra help with planning, coordination, setup. What if I offered my services? Rashid looked skeptical. Would she hire someone she doesn't know? Margaret smiled slightly. She won't be hiring me. You will. Tell her. Your family traditions require certain touches for the ceremony, specific arrangements that need someone with hotel event experience. Recommend me highly. Insist on it even. She can't refuse without seeming uncooperative. The plan was risky and required Margaret to take an extended leave from her regular job, something she'd never done in 37 years. But the hotel manager owed her favors after all her years of reliable service, and she had vacation time accumulated that she'd never used. More than that, she felt alive for the first time since Daniel's death. This mattered. This was real. There's one more thing we need to consider, Rashid said carefully. My mother. She'll be here in 3 weeks. I can't keep lying to her, Margaret. I've decided I have to tell her the truth before she makes the trip, but I'm terrified of what it might do to her, how disappointed she'll be. Margaret reached across the table and did something she never would have dared with. A stranger. She placed her hand over his. Then tell her the whole truth, not just about the fake engagement, but about the loneliness that made you vulnerable to Catherine's manipulation, about the pressure you felt to give her peace, about your genuine desire to find real connection someday, just not on anyone else's timeline. If she loves you, and I suspect she does, she'll understand. Over the following week, Margaret's transformation from invisible housekeeper to secret investigator began. Rashid arranged everything as they'd discussed, telling Catherine that his family's traditions required special attention to wedding details, and insisting that Margaret, with her extensive hotel event experience, be hired as a private consultant. Catherine agreed with thinly veiled annoyance, but she agreed. Margaret found herself at Catherine's Pacific Heights mansion, a sprawling testament to wealth and status, meeting with the woman who'd orchestrated this entire deception. Rashid tells me you're some kind of event specialist, Catherine said dismissively, looking Margaret up and down with the disdain some wealthy people reserved for hired help. I suppose we could use someone to handle the tedious details. Margaret played her role perfectly, deferential but competent, eager to please but not obsequious. She asked careful questions about Catherine's vision for the wedding, took copious notes, and began establishing herself as useful and unobtrusive. Most importantly, she began observing. She noticed how Natasha moved through the house like a ghost, cleaning, cooking, serving Catherine and her adult children without ever being acknowledged. She noticed the locked office where Catherine conducted business calls with raised voices and veiled threats. She noticed the way Catherine watched Natasha constantly, as if afraid the young woman might escape or reveal something damaging. The exploitation was obvious once you looked for it, but Catherine had normalized it so thoroughly that even her own family seemed to see Natasha as furniture rather than a person. On her third day at the mansion, Margaret was organizing wedding favor samples in the dining room when Natasha entered to clean. The young woman moved mechanically, her earlier performance polish completely absent. Margaret spoke quietly in English, aware that Catherine was upstairs on a business call. "Your name is really Natasha?" The young woman startled, then nodded warily. "Natasha Ivanova, yes. You are wedding planner?" Margaret shook her head. "I'm Margaret. I'm a friend, and I know about your situation. The real situation, not the story Catherine tells everyone." She watched fear flash across Natasha's face. "Please don't be frightened. I'm not going to expose you or make things worse. I want to help you, but I need you to trust me." Natasha's story emerged in whispered fragments over several meetings, stolen conversations during Catherine's absences, careful exchanges when they could be sure of privacy. She'd come from Odessa, Ukraine, at 26 years old, a recent widow whose husband had been killed in the violence that plagued her region. Catherine had recruited her through an agency, promising a legitimate job in America, a path to citizenship, safety, and opportunity. But the reality had been imprisonment disguised as employment. Catherine held all Natasha's documents, controlled every aspect of her life, threatened deportation if she complained. The engagement to Rashid was supposed to be Natasha's ticket to freedom. Catherine had promised that after 6 months, Natasha would receive papers, money, release from servitude. But Natasha was smart enough to doubt those promises now. "She says I am worth more to her as worker," Natasha explained, her English heavily accented but clear. "Why would she free me when she can keep me cleaning her house, cooking her meals, doing whatever she asks? The green card is carrot on stick, always promised, never given." She looked at Margaret with eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone so young. "But what can I do? I have no papers, no money, no friends here. If I run, I am a legal immigrant with no protection. If I stay, I am slave. Either way, I am trapped." Margaret felt fury rising in her chest, the specific fury of women who've watched other women being exploited, controlled, diminished by those with more power. "You're not trapped anymore," she said firmly, "because now you have friends, and we're going to get you free." Over the next several days, Margaret and Natasha worked together, gathering evidence. Natasha knew where Catherine kept her files, the office she'd been forbidden to enter, but whose lock she'd figured out how to pick years ago in desperate search of her own documents. While Catherine was at business meetings, they photographed contracts, emails, financial records, showing payments to immigration officials, communications with other women Catherine had employed over the years in similar circumstances. It was damaging, comprehensive evidence of labor trafficking and document fraud, enough to interest federal investigators if presented correctly. Margaret sent everything to Rashid, who consulted with attorneys specializing in immigration rights and labor law. The picture they assembled was worse than any of them had imagined. Catherine Pemberton had been running this scheme for over a decade, bringing in vulnerable women and exploiting them systematically while maintaining her reputation as a philanthropist and business leader. The breaking point came 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding. Catherine's son, Marcus, a lawyer in his 40s, returned home unexpectedly and found Margaret and Natasha in Catherine's office. They'd been photographing the last batch of documents, so focused on their task that they hadn't heard him enter the house. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus demanded, his face flushing with anger. Margaret's heart hammered, but she stood her ground. "We're gathering evidence of your mother's illegal activities, labor trafficking, document fraud, exploitation of immigrants. If you're smart, you'll distance yourself from this before we go to the authorities." Marcus's expression shifted from anger to calculation to something like fear. "You're insane. My mother is a respected businesswoman. No one will believe these accusations." But Natasha stepped forward then, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "They will believe 7 women women, all with same story, all with documents showing how your mother controls their lives. Margaret has found others, in San Jose, in Palo Alto, in Marin, all brought here with promises, all kept as prisoners. We have evidence, Mr. Pemberton. We have proof, and we have lawyer waiting to file complaints with Federal Immigration Enforcement and Labor Department. It was a bluff. They hadn't yet contacted all those other women, though they'd found their contact information in Catherine's files. But Marcus didn't know that. Margaret watched him process the implications, understanding how thoroughly his mother's carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "I didn't know," Marcus said finally, his voice quieter. "I suspected Mother's household help arrangements were questionable, but I told myself it wasn't my business. I didn't want to know." He looked at both women, shame crossing his face. "What do you want? Money to disappear? Recommendations for new positions?" Margaret shook her head. "We want Natasha's freedom, her real documents, not forged ones, legal status independently verified, money she's owed for years of unpaid labor, and we want your mother to face consequences. Maybe not criminal charges if she cooperates, but certainly public exposure of her activities and requirements that she make. Do things right for all the women she's exploited." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "Let me talk to her. Give me 24 hours before you take this to authorities. Maybe we can resolve this without destroying everything." The confrontation between Catherine and her son happened that evening in the mansion's library. Margaret wasn't present, but Rashid was. Catherine had demanded his attendance, apparently believing he could be leveraged against whatever accusations were being leveled. She was wrong. Rashid later described the scene to Margaret, Catherine's initial outrage giving way to defensive justifications, Marcus's horrified realization of the full extent of his mother's activities, and ultimately Catherine's cold calculation about damage control. She was a survivor, Margaret realized, the kind of person who would sacrifice anything and anyone to protect her own interests. But even she recognized when the game was over. The deal they struck was comprehensive. Natasha would receive legitimate immigration papers, independently processed through attorneys Marcus hired specifically for that purpose. She'd receive $50,000 in compensation, not nearly enough for years of unpaid labor, but enough to start a real life. All of Catherine's other employees would receive similar treatment, their status regularized and their freedom guaranteed. Catherine would quietly retire from her business activities, citing health reasons, and would face no criminal prosecution as long as she fully cooperated with making her victims whole. The engagement to Rashid would be terminated immediately, the business contracts modified to remove Catherine's involvement. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was pragmatic resolution that prioritized the victim's freedom over satisfaction of seeing Catherine punished. "I wanted her to pay more," Rashid admitted to Margaret when they met at the cafe to discuss the outcome. "I wanted her publicly exposed, her reputation destroyed, her wealth confiscated to compensate all the women she's hurt. But my lawyers convinced me that criminal prosecution would be lengthy, uncertain, and potentially disastrous for the victims. Many of them are terrified of deportation and wouldn't testify. Some have family back home who could be threatened. Catherine's connections might shield her anyway. This resolution, imperfect as it is, guarantees freedom for Natasha and the others. That matters more than my desire for revenge." Margaret understood the compromise, even as she hated its necessity. "And your mother, does she know the truth now?" Rashid's expression softened with something like relief, mixed with residual fear. "I called her 2 days ago, told her everything, the fake engagement, the reasons I'd agreed to it, the whole tangled mess. I expected disappointment, anger, maybe even her rejection." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Instead, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Rashid, my son, I raised you to value truth and integrity above convenience. I'm disappointed that you forgot those values, but I'm proud that you found your way back to them. The engagement means nothing. Your character means everything. Now tell me, what can I do to help fix this situation?" His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She's more concerned about Natasha's welfare than about my marital status. She wants to help however she can." Margaret felt her own eyes sting. She sounds like a remarkable woman. Rashid nodded. She is, and she said something else that's been haunting me. She said, I don't need to see you married to know you're capable of deep love. I see it in how you've tried to protect a young woman you barely know from the consequences of your mistakes. I see it in how you've trusted a stranger, this Margaret Chen you keep mentioning, with your vulnerabilities. Love appears in unexpected forms. Rashid, perhaps you're already learning that lesson. He looked at Margaret directly. She wants to meet you. When she comes next month, she's insisting on it. She says any woman who would risk her livelihood to tell an uncomfortable truth to a powerful stranger is worth knowing. Margaret felt simultaneously flattered and terrified. I'm not sure what a hotel housekeeper would have to say to a woman like your mother. But Rashid smiled. You're not just a hotel housekeeper, Margaret. You're a woman who saw injustice and acted. You're someone who helped untangle a mess that could have destroyed multiple lives. You're someone who made me feel less alone in a crisis than I've felt in years. That's not nothing. That matters. The way he looked at her when he said those words made Margaret's heart skip unexpectedly. There was admiration in that look, yes, but also something warmer, something that felt like the beginning of genuine connection. She dismissed it immediately. Ridiculous to think there could be anything romantic between a wealthy Arab businessman and an aging housekeeper. Their worlds were too different, their circumstances too mismatched. And yet something was growing between them in these weeks of shared purpose, these conversations that stretched long and comfortable over coffee and strategy sessions. The wedding that never happened became instead a celebration of a different kind. Natasha, newly free with legal papers and money of her own, decided to remain in San Francisco. She enrolled in community college to complete the education interrupted by years of exploitation, and she volunteered at an immigrant rights organization, helping other women escape similar situations. Margaret helped her find an affordable apartment in the Richmond district and introduced her to her own network of friends, working-class women who'd navigated America's challenges and triumphs for decades. Watching Natasha bloom into confidence and joy was its own reward, proof that their efforts had genuinely mattered. Meanwhile, something unexpected developed between Margaret and Rashid. What began as strategic alliance deepened into genuine friendship, then slowly transformed into something neither had anticipated. Rashid started joining Margaret for her walks along the Embarcadero after her shifts, the two of them talking about everything and nothing. His childhood in Dubai, her years with Daniel, their shared love of old movies and good food, and the particular magic of San Francisco at twilight. Margaret found herself laughing again, looking forward to each day in ways she hadn't since becoming a widow. Rashid seemed lighter too, the loneliness that had shadowed him lifting gradually as he opened himself to connection without agenda or performance. When Rashid's mother, Amira, arrived in San Francisco 6 weeks after the engagement dissolution, she embraced Margaret like a long-lost friend. Over traditional Arabic coffee in Rashid's suite at the Fairmont, the older woman, elegant even in her illness, fierce in her love for her son, told Margaret, "You gave him back to himself. You reminded him that integrity matters more than convenience, that real connection is worth more than comfortable lies. For that, you have my eternal gratitude." Then Amira smiled with the particular knowing look that mothers perfect over lifetimes. "Also, I think you make my son happy in ways he hasn't been happy in many years. I'm hoping you'll consider letting that happiness continue even after this crisis has passed." Margaret blushed, stammering something about different worlds and impractical circumstances, but Amira waved away her objections. "Love is the most practical thing in the world. Everything else is just details." 6 months later, in a simple ceremony attended by close friends and family, Margaret Chen married Rashid Al-Farouq, not in a ballroom filled with society's elite, but in a small garden overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, with Natasha as a bridesmaid and Amira beaming despite her illness. Margaret wore a simple cream dress, Rashid a dark suit, and their vows were honest and real, promises to see each other truly, to build something genuine together, to prove that love appears in unexpected forms, and that the invisible woman and the lonely billionaire could find each other against all odds. When they kissed, Everyone cheered, and Margaret thought about the night she'd overheard that conversation in the service hallway. The decision to speak up that had changed everything. Sometimes courage means nothing more than refusing to stay silent. Sometimes love finds you when you're not performing for anyone, just being honestly, imperfectly yourself. And sometimes the fairy tale everyone wanted to hear was never as beautiful as the truth that unfolded when pretense fell away. This was real. This was theirs. And invisible no longer, Margaret Chen had finally fully been seen.